Recording in progress, another episode of the Square and Compass podcast. This time, we are in North Carolina. Second time there. I interviewed, oh my gosh, and now I can't even remember the name of the brother. Do you remember Brother Ben?
Yeah, Worshipful Brother Ben Wallace.
There we go, Worshipful Brother Ben Wallace. For a second, I was going to say Cameron Bailey. That was in Washington, far, far away from. But yeah, Ben Wallace regarding Esotericon, which both of us had the pleasure of attending. But back in North Carolina with Brother Matt Parker. Thank you so much for joining.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, we met through, I suppose it would have been through Brother Randy Sanders and his Masonic Happy Hour, also online. You're very active in Refracted Light and the Masonic Legacy Society, a lot of presentations that you've done over the years. And as we can see from your shirt, you are involved with the different Masonicons, Esotericons. Let's start with that. Especially over the last year, well, I guess year and a half, with so much of the educational content moving to a virtual setting. How did you find that affected you? Were you doing more stuff both as a guest and as a lecturer online? And what do you think, as our vaccination rates go up, as restrictions are lifted, do you still see a place for virtual education? Or do you think it's going to return back to primarily in-lodge, in-person events?
I think I'll start with the virtual education. I think that's here to stay. I believe it will scale back a little bit because, of course, us brothers that are providing virtual education, like yourself with your podcasts, and the Masonic Roundtable guys and the Unknown Philosophers, all the different variety of Masonic education that's available out there. At some point, we have to start returning to our lodges or Scottish Rite, York Rite, Shriners, whatever we are involved in. And most of us are very involved in a multitude of Masonic bodies. So I do see that it may be scaled back a bit. But what we have found is that there's a tremendous need and thirst for this education. We have brothers who maybe cannot attend lodge on a regular basis. Maybe they are deployed with the military. Maybe their job, their family doesn't allow for that time. And of course, family and career, things like that take priority over Masonry. And so we get a lot of messages from brothers really all over the world thanking us for what we do, because that's how they receive their Masonic experience. So I do think it filled a need that's actually been there for quite a long time, even prior to the pandemic. Just no one had addressed that need other than maybe Castle Island Virtual Lodge or Endeavour Virtual Lodge in Victoria, Australia. But aside from that, there was not a lot going on. Of course, you had Robert Johnson, who's just had his 500th episode of the Whence Came You podcast. So he's been going at that for a while, doing an outstanding job. But the resources were not really numerous. It was the same guys doing the work. And now it has just exploded. And I think it's going to stay. And like I said, I think it'll scale back a little bit because everyone's schedule is starting to open up. But I think it's here to stay.
To what extent do you and I've talked about this a lot on my podcast, the challenge that I have with the idea of Masonic education is the esoteric, and I'm using the word esoteric in a very like in a very specific sense of insular versus for the world, an insular thing is how esoteric it can be viewed as. I mean, the example of a podcast such as this one, such as, the excellent Whence Came You, the excellent Masonic Roundtable, but we'll use this one specifically. It certainly is my hope that Masons, wherever they are in their Masonic journey, find this podcast and are able to learn something of value to their Masonic journey from yourself, as well as all the other guests I've had. But it is also, my hope that non-Masons find this podcast and are able to learn something, because I've likened it many times to mixed martial arts, music. When Joe Rogan, for example, has Dustin Poirier, Conor McGregor, whoever it is, he has a mixed martial arts fighter on his podcast, he's not advertising that solely to other mixed martial artists, right? There is something of interest and value that, a Dustin Poirier, a fighter, has learned from engaging in mixed martial arts, but that is applicable to almost anybody. And you see that based on just the audience it turns in. And I think with Freemasonry, so often there can be this tendency for people to hear, oh, it's a Masonic podcast, it's a Masonic event. If I'm not a Mason, I won't get anything of value from it. And I just think, there are things that for good reason are secret and should be kept secret. But the overall philosophy and lessons from the craft, I think that is something that many people can learn from, and could benefit the world. So I think sometimes our Masonic education, it's important that it's Masonic themed, but it's applicable to a lot of people and a lot of struggles in life.
So I will say this, first, we all tend to use the phrase Masonic education just for, I think, lack of a better term. I often refer to it as enlightenment rather than Masonic education, because Masonic education could be a very broad brush. If someone were to tell me that John Wayne was a Mason, yeah, technically that counts as Masonic education, but have I gotten anything from that? Does that make me a better person for knowing that, hey, this famous actor was a Mason? It means nothing to me. It's interesting, but it's not really worth my time to discuss that. When we talk about esoterics, that's a little bit of a taboo word in Masonry. And so I tend to throw it out there quite a bit, just more or less for shock value more than anything else. But what is esoterics? It just means that it's just what's hidden below the surface, what's just beneath. And I have a firm belief that all Masons on some level are esoteric. It just depends on how deep they're comfortable going with that. You can have brothers who really take something away from the degrees just on the superficial level, but there's something there that resonates with them. There's something esoteric there that resonates with them. And so I think, the thing about esoterics and Masonry, I really do think they go hand in hand, but it's really how we define esoterics. Are we getting off on some tangent where we're talking about astrology and numerology and natal charts and all of this stuff? And that's fine. Some brothers are into that. I don't understand it. I've tried to learn. I've tried to absorb that. It just doesn't register with me. But it doesn't mean that it's any less a part of Masonry as anything else we might be discussing, whether it be the 4 cardinal virtues or the symbolism of the 3rd degree, the building of the Temple of Solomon. All of these things are very esoteric.
Where do you think and this is something I've struggled with. I'm the first to admit I have I can have kind of a love-hate relationship with the esoteric side of things. And the thing I struggle with is, where do you think, and how do you think a lodge and a Mason can find a balance between, for lack of a better term, the pragmatic or the boring, if you want to use a derisive term, the boring side of it versus the the esoteric. You know, on one extreme, I'll just give the example. We have a brother who I've met, and he's argued many times that the Masonic business meeting should be scrapped altogether. That the administrative functions of a lodge can be done by, you know, the worshipful master, the treasurer, the secretary, and you know, you can include maybe some wardens or assistant secretary in there, but that can all be done via Zoom or at the coffee shop. He said, you know, the administrative aspects is something that people deal with every day in their own life, balancing their checkbooks at work, whatever it is. Said, you know, it's the degrees and the esotericism side of it. That's what separates Masonry, and that's what our entire focus should be on. I personally do not agree with that sentiment. I think there is a place for to be bored in a lodge, for lack of a term. I think that stuff is relevant, but just finding the balance between the pragmatic and the esoteric, and how do you make sure that you have a healthy balance of both in a lodge?
Yeah. I'm not sure that you're ever going to have a perfect balance in any lodge. You're going to have some brothers who are in it for the fraternalization. They like to get together with brothers, meet for dinner. You have brothers that are in it for maybe the charity that the lodges are doing. You have other brothers who are in it for the education, maybe the historical side of it, not necessarily the esoteric. You have the brothers that lean more towards the esoteric. You have brothers that are all over the place. They join Masonry and stay with Masonry for different reasons. So, you know, number one, we can't pigeonhole Masonry as being one specific thing, because it's many things to many brothers. My personal philosophy is that true Masonry takes place outside of the lodge room. It takes place when brothers like you and I are conversing, or with Randy Sanders in the Masonic Happy Hour, or just discussing these principles and philosophies and subjects in what I like to call the meeting after the meeting. So when the lodge closes, brothers just sit around and you know, maybe smoke some cigars and chat about these things and share ideas. The lodge should be a place to reinforce those Masonic values, to reinforce what we're there for. The lodge is a sacred space. Is there a place for the boardroom style business meetings where we're discussing bills that need to be paid, or things of that nature? Absolutely, all day long. Yes, that belongs in the lodge. Don't leave that up to a committee. Don't leave that up to certain officers in the lodge to make all the decisions. In a lodge, we're all on the level. We are all equal. So every brother, from the master to the brother sitting on the sidelines, each and every brother in that lodge has a right to know exactly what's going on and take part in the decision-making process. We don't leave it up to a certain board or you know, committee to make all the decisions and run with it. It's okay to have a committee to do some planning and then report back to the lodge. Ultimately, the lodge needs to make the decision as a whole. So I don't know if that's kind of where you were going with that or not. I just think that we put a lot of emphasis on education in Masonic Lodge meetings, which is great. I expect to see that in every meeting, that enlightenment. But you run the risk of, if you lay it on too heavy, you run the risk of running some guys off. If you focus just on charity, then you're going to run the guys off that are there for the education or enlightenment. If you just focus on reading the minutes of the lodge and discussing business, then you're going to run off another set of guys. So I think there is a way to find a balance, but that balance is not giving everything to everyone. It's just giving enough to keep everyone satisfied. And that's going to change from lodge to lodge, because each lodge has their own flavor, their own character.
You know, that's an interesting a point, I think, worth examining, is the reasons for either approaching a lodge, because not everybody who approaches a lodge ends up joining for any number of reasons, but the reasons behind somebody both approaching a lodge and then you know, becoming a member. And on the other side, the reasons that a lodge has for accepting an application, right? It's not always a matter of the person putting in the application, right? You can have lodges accepting members for, it's funny. Um, I've seen the same admonition in the States as in my own lodge. I don't know if that's the same in North Carolina, but the premise that you're not supposed to wish to join Freemasonry for mercenary reasons, for financial gain. But a lodge will oftentimes, I've found, unfortunately, accept an application for mercenary means, for the money, as opposed to whether or not the candidate would be a good fit, or is actually joining for necessarily good reasons. How do you that initial sussing out period from the initial approach of the applicant to the degree? I guess, what would you say, as somebody who's very active in the craft, who does a lot of work on the education side and the virtual side and in person? Just what are some pitfalls you see at that initial approach? Do you think that there are reasons for to disqualify an applicant? I've heard some people say, don't disqualify anybody, with obvious exceptions, but as a general rule, don't disqualify anybody because they may be joining for not the right reasons, but you never know, after their first degree, they could fall in love with it and become the best Mason ever. Somebody told me, you need 15 new Masons to get one good one. Basically saying you can never know. And the other side of it is, no, we need to guard the West Gate. If a lodge has any ill feelings about an applicant, or just they're not quite in it for the right reasons, not to accept the application. Just what are your thoughts on that side of things?
So Masonry is not here to convert men or to sway them over to one way of thinking. We're not here to admit just any man that petitions joining the lodge in hopes that maybe he will one day see the light and want to take part of it. And that's foolish. We have a past Grand Master in North Carolina who said something to me a few years ago that has always stuck with me. He said, more damage has been done by white balls than black cubes. He's absolutely right. We have let in so many men who, they may have been good men, but they were not meant to be Masons. They didn't have the hearts of Masons. They can be fine, upstanding citizens, pillars of their community, but maybe Masonry is not right for them. If they're looking for a charitable organization, there are thousands and thousands of charities out there that do wonderful work that they may be better suited towards. And unfortunately, that's the reason why we lose so many members, is we're admitting these men, they go through the degrees, and then they discovered Masonry is not what they thought it was, and they're gone. They disappear. Lodges, due to shrinking numbers, have become desperate for money, and even Grand Lodges, some Grand Lodge jurisdictions. And so they're almost marketing Masonry as if it's a product. They're almost pandering to men to get them to join the lodge just so they have dues paying members. They have no interest in that man or where he comes from or what his goals are. They have no interest in what he expects out of Masonry. They just want that dues check coming in so they can keep the lights on. And if that's how a lodge is surviving, then that lodge just needs to close its doors, because that is not Masonry. I have very, very strong feelings about that. We had in Masonry in the US and Canada, after World War I, we had a big bubble of servicemen returning from war, and they were looking for that fraternal experience that they had in the military. And so they flooded into fraternal organizations such as Masonry or the Moose or Elks Lodge, and even formed new fraternal orders. And the same thing happened just 20 years later, after the end of World War II. You had the same bubble happen. So now you've got servicemen from World War I and World War II in our lodges. They're there for the fraternal experience. And some of them were there for the esoteric or to study the symbolism, really dig into the degrees. But there were too many of them that were there for other reasons. And so we call it Masonic education, enlightenment. These things were put on the back burner or sometimes forgotten altogether in lodges, which is really sad. We're seeing a renaissance in Masonry right now. We're seeing a return to that education, that enlightenment, the study. Are our numbers going to continue to shrink? Yes. Are lodges going to continue to close or merge? Yes, that's going to continue to happen, and it needs to happen. It's healthy. I think the reduction in membership is a healthy sign of our fraternity. We are returning to a normal status, what's normal for us. We were never meant to be this huge fraternity. There was a time in most Masonic jurisdictions where you couldn't put a Masonic bumper sticker on the back of your car. You couldn't really advertise that outside maybe a lapel pin or a ring, and that was it, because it wasn't meant to be advertised. It wasn't meant to be marketed. Now we have clever little phrases like "to be one, ask one," and making good men better. And all of these are marketing phrases that someone has come up with, but they're very hollow, really. That's not what Masonry is, in my opinion. And of course, that's just my opinion. So, feel free to send hate mail my way. But I think we had lost sight over a period of time of what our actual purpose was in Masonry. And I'm just thrilled to death that we're having this renaissance in Masonry. I know you've spoken with worshipful brother Ben Wallace and some others that I've had the same conversation with them, and we're all pretty much on the same page with that we just need to get leaner and more fit as a fraternity.
I've talked with them, and I do have to admit though, and this might get some hate mail sent my way. I'm not sure if I agree with those sentiments fully. I can understand where they come from, and it could just be my connection to the craft. Is like I have a slightly different history with Freemasonry, or at least the way I always viewed it. I don't know. I'm torn. I understand the basic idea, and I certainly agree with you. One of the major problems we've had is a rush to get and collect dues at the expense of properly vetting. And I'm not going to say. So the brother who told me, you need to bring in 15 applicants to get one good Mason. I'm not going to necessarily put negative intentions in what he said. I think he might have meant it in the same way. I used to deal a lot and work a lot with people who had addictions. And in AA, there was like a 7-to-1 or something. Like they always said, you just keep trying, and you're not going to, if you just keep working on it, eventually you'll get that one, but you need to bring in a bunch of people. And I think when he said, he didn't mean it in a negative sense. He just meant, he's an eternal optimist and thought, the more you bring in, the more good ones will kind of go through the sieve. But I agree. I just don't think that's the right approach to take, because if you're not taking it, it's not fair to anybody. It's not fair to the degree team who puts on the degree for an applicant who ends up not liking the experience, and it's not fair to the applicant himself. And I do agree with you. It's not, the focus shouldn't be on the money, either in terms of the candidate wanting to join or the lodge accepting the candidate.
So let me throw this out there to you. Just what you said, and the brother that said that it takes 15 candidates to get one good Mason. He's basically referring to what's commonly referred to as the law of large numbers. The more numbers you throw out there, the more results you're going to get. There's a law of averages out there, but that doesn't apply to Masonry. And why not? Because we take certain obligations to keep our secrets to ourselves. We take obligations to keep Masonry to ourselves. There are certain things we just don't discuss with everyone. And we're very hypocritical because the first guy that shows up at the door with money in his hand and wants to join, we welcome him in. We run him through the degrees. We teach him the grips, the signs, the words, all of this stuff that we have taken an obligation not to disclose. And then he's dissatisfied and he leaves, and we've just sent him out into the world with all this information. Have we learned nothing from the Morgan affair? Have we learned nothing from, Leo Trexel, the Trexel hoax? There's just been a number of instances throughout Masonic history that show that there's a fallacy in doing just that, yet we continue to do it. And it's horrible. And I can actually speak from experience. There was a gentleman and his son that we initiated into our craft. And they seemed like really great, upstanding guys. But they did not get it. They tried to turn Masonry into what they thought it should be. They were very deceitful, did a lot of things that I'm not going to get into details, but ended up being expelled from the craft. They should have never been invited in or admitted in. They were not invited. They just, petitioned, joined the lodge. And it really was for no other reason than they had the money to pay the dues and the initiation fee. So the lodge was happy to welcome them in. In North Carolina, we do background checks on everyone. I know not every jurisdiction does that, but we do background checks. And the standard for way too many lodges is that if a man can pass a background check and he can pay his dues, then he's in. There's no reason to blackball him at that point. And that's dangerous.
That's an interesting side note. I've not really got into this much. So we don't do background checks in Ontario. I have, heard of applicants who apply, and then because a brother knows of something they did, they get blackballed. We don't use cubes here. We have black and white balls. But I've seen the cubes before. I got a little laugh when I heard that. It's funny how some jurisdictions have it. Makes more sense, the cubes, because for blind brethren. But that's a whole other kind of I struggle though with the idea of background checks, in the sense that I was a probation and parole officer for 2 years, and then I worked in a jail as a rehab officer for about 5 years. Actually, so I was in the criminal justice system for 10 years, and I was on the rehab community reintegration side of things. And and this is, I'm not speaking for, before anybody yells at me, I speak for me, not for any Grand Lodges. This is all my opinions. One thing that always bothered me is, even if somebody has done insert most heinous offense here, unless the plan is to keep them incarcerated forever, or if you have the death penalty, sooner or later they're going to be in the community. And all the evidence, and just as I would back this up based on my experiences, demonstrates that if you don't want somebody to reoffend, protective factors include things like stable employment, which I think is the highest. Being employed, very likely to stop somebody from reoffending behavior. But also community engagements and community interactions. And so, I understand why, for example, say a place of employment wouldn't want to hire somebody with a certain, with a criminal record, certainly depending on the people that group is working with or whatever it is. Like, there might be very good reasons to not do so, but if having a criminal record is a disqualification from being part of a community, whether it be being part of a Masonic lodge or having a job or whatever it is, I worry that all you're doing is increasing the likelihood of reoffending behavior. And as somebody who more than one occasion was on the phone to an employer, or on the phone to this or that, saying like, this guy's taken courses, he's doing this, he's doing that, he's trying to turn his life around. I don't know how I feel about a background check as disqualifying somebody from the craft, even in the case of very heinous offense.
Let me throw this out there to you, though, and I'm just speaking for North Carolina. We have not been doing background checks that long, maybe a decade now, where it just became readily available just to, contact the court and get a background check. And even then, the background check doesn't disqualify a man from Masonry. The Grand Lodge reviews the background check just to see if there's any red flags. And if there are red flags, they'll notify the lodge. But ultimately, it's up to the lodge to still investigate the gentleman, to vote on him. And if they see, hey, you've had this conviction for this, ask him about it. What was this about? How long has it been? What was the nature of the crime? It doesn't necessarily preclude a man from being a Mason. But if you have someone who is, let's say, a repeat offender, and they are maybe crimes like, let's say, embezzlement or white collar crime, something like that, but they've done that repeatedly or had several convictions, or maybe it's very recently, maybe that's not a man you want to admit into your lodge, because what if one day he's elected treasurer of your lodge? You've got a problem. A man who is, we had a situation in a lodge not too long ago where there was a man who had repeated offenses for domestic assault. And they thought, oh, he's a nice guy, let him in. And unfortunately, he was very detrimental to that lodge, because that same attitude, that same demeanor, he brought into the lodge room, and it really caused some stress in that lodge until, fortunately, he was arrested again and ended up being brought up on Masonic charges and expelled from the fraternity, but probably should have never been admitted in. And that's not to say that he wouldn't make a great Mason at some point in the future. I don't ever want to disqualify anybody permanently from ever being a Mason. It wasn't the right time for him. He was still trying to work through his own demons. And Masonry is not I'll say Masonry doesn't really offer a path to salvation. If I'm putting that, I may be wording that the wrong way. I don't want anyone to take offense to that, but we are not here to be a rescue organization. We're not here to take stray men and try to make them better. Those men have to be able to come into Masonry with the heart of a Mason. They have to have some moral compass when they come to us. And too often, I see it happening in lodges repeatedly. We just treat Masonry as if it's a rescue group. We're here to save wayward men and turn their lives around. And that's not what we do. There are other organizations that are far better equipped to do that, not us.
Yeah, and the timing is a good point that you brought up, right? Like there's somebody may at one point in future be a good Mason, but yeah, if he is, right, because using domestic violence example, it's oftentimes about power and control, and usually men who are engaged in those things feel powerless. And then, if so, there would be a danger that if he's not attended counseling and if he's not worked through those issues, he's going to try to exert undue power and influence in a lodge as well. So yeah, sometimes it is a matter of just the timing, right? And how do they talk about their offenses? Do they admit to them and admit it was a mistake and I'm trying to make amends to it, versus is it the world is against me type of thing? Like what is actually the way? And that goes more to, I like the way you described it, right? It's a process. It's not just you get the background check and then disqualified or not disqualified. It's you get the background check, and then if there's something on there, you talk to the brother, you ask him about it. That's why there's no reason why a application needs to be accepted within an hour of meeting the candidate. You can have multiple meetings and multiple events and bring them out to different things and get to know them before you actually accept an application.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I really like what the Grand Lodge in California does as far as investigating candidates. The Master of the Lodge will appoint an investigation committee of 3 men, but the Master appoints them all individually. So no one on that committee knows who the other 2 men on the committee are. And each one of them interviews the candidate independently and comes up with their own conclusion. Is this man a good fit for the lodge? Is he right for Masonry? And so you don't have undue influence from other members of that committee or trying to sway the committee one way or the other, because I've seen it happen where one person on the committee who had a very dominant personality swayed the decision for the entire committee. And unfortunately, good men who probably had a place in Masonry were not admitted in because of one man. And that can be dangerous.
That's interesting. The committee, and we have a committee in Ontario, but it's all 3 go and meet at the same time. I've never heard of a committee where it's individually done. Yeah, I'd like there's definitely a very strong argument in favor of that approach, or even like a 4th separate one. Because sometimes being on a committee, it's an interesting way to build camaraderie with a fellow Mason. You may, as a worshipful master, you'll put you'll create a committee of investigation, and you'll use an older Mason and a younger Mason, and you'll try to create a committee in such a way that you're not only creating a relationship between the committee and the applicant, but you're creating a relationship between the committee members themselves. But as you said, the danger of that is if you have is the newer Mason going to feel that he has to defer to the older Mason's counsel? Like it's an interesting idea. It's worth examining for sure, is splitting up the committee somehow so that you don't have that danger. Do you know of any other jurisdictions that do that, or is California one you've heard of?
California is the only one I've heard of, and I just learned that recently. I was up at the Masonicon in Massachusetts and speaking with a California brother who explained that to me. And I thought that was fascinating because that thought had never occurred to me. In North Carolina, we're like you are in Ontario, where usually all 3 men on the committee go out and meet together. And what's funny is our code requires that there be 3 Masons appointed to the committee, but it only takes 2 committee members to sign off on the petition. So really, I have seen it happen over and over. We've appointed 3 men to the committee. One person couldn't make it to the investigation, so it was just left up to the other 2 guys. And I'm not so sure there's really anything wrong with that, because it is hard to get everyone's schedule to align at all times. It just doesn't happen. That's fine. But my main concern is I want to make sure that a man is getting a fair investigation. If the committee meets with him and says, okay, do you believe in God? Yes. Okay. Can you pay the dues? Yes. Okay. You're in. That's it. That's it. And I've seen that happen over and over and over. And I have a different approach when I'm on an investigation committee, which is probably the reason why my lodge does not like to put me on investigation committees. I try to dissuade the man from joining Masonry. I try to talk him out of it because I want to see how serious he is about Masonry. I got into a little hot water several years ago because we were investigating a gentleman who was the son of a member of the lodge. And the other gentleman on the committee asked their questions. Do you believe in God? Yada, yada, yada. And I stayed quiet. I listened to their answers. And then I said, why do you want to be a Mason? He said, well, my dad's a Mason. I said, okay, but why do you want to be a Mason? He said, well, my grandfather's a Mason. I said, okay, but why do you want to be a Mason? He absolutely could not answer the question, other than he knew his grandfather was a Mason and his dad was a Mason. So family heritage, he should be a Mason. And I could not recommend him. I could not give him a favorable report. Just couldn't, because he had no clue why he wanted to join Masonry. He had no clue what Masonry was about. He looked at it as a family legacy. And I'm sorry, and I don't mean to offend brothers who are, sons and grandsons of Masons, and that it's in your family. I know brothers, they're 5 and 6 generation Masons, and that's fine. That's great. But that can't be the reason why we admit someone into the craft. That just can't be the sole reason. There has to be more there.
I want to go back to, I think it would be, the area of probably the main area of disagreement I have with a lot of Masons, kind of now in 2021, going back to, the discussion around 1920s Freemasonry and 1950s, right? The bubble. I don't know if you ever read the book Bowling Alone by Putnam.
In fact, I've got it here somewhere. Yeah, right here.
I want to have Putnam on my podcast very, very much. I think I sent him a message a while ago. If you're listening, because I'm very fond of that book. And so, and I don't mean this in a derisive way. So I think people tend to take it in that way. Is in the 1920s and the 50s, and this is based primarily on, my own research in terms of looking at newspapers from that time and reports on Freemasonry from the media, as well as I never talked about it, with my grandfather or my father directly, but I certainly could suss out their views on the craft. That they were all Freemasons. People joined Freemasonry. Men joined Freemasonry in the way a housewife joined, like, the PTA. It was a community institution, and if you were a member of, especially in smaller towns, if you were a member of that community, that town, there was just this expectation that you would be a Mason. But it wasn't like, I think that's a good thing. I'm a big believer in this idea of the craft as being a community institution, and something that, if you believe in, is something that contributes to the peace and good order in a community, in the same way that the PTA, it supports the school. A Masonic temple supports City Hall in a lot of different ways. If you look back at the newspapers and the reports, I mean, everybody's talking about vaccinations right now. Where did, especially in Canada, but I'm sure in the States too, where did the local government and health unit go when they had to have a vaccination clinic? They went to the Masonic Temple. In World War II, the Windsor Masonic Temple, and I believe many others, were depots used to gather salvage or scrap metal to help supply fighters overseas. It was, a place of homecomings and dances, and being a member of the Masonic Temple meant, or being a member of the Masonic Lodge meant that you were a member of the community and were supported therein. And some guys took it, in the Bowling Alone book, there's the talk about, I think the name was Barry the Joiner. I don't know if you recall that section. I think it was Barry.
I don't recall. It's been a while since I've read it.
Some named the joiner. It was like a derisive description in the 1920s of, like, a man who was, Barry, who's like a Mason and an elk and a moose and a Rotary Club member, and he's like all these different things, and he just joins because he wants to be the big shot walking downtown and has part of all these groups. But So for me, like when I was joining Freemasonry, I always viewed it first and foremost as a community organization. It was a place where I went because my dad was a Mason, my grandfather, right? It was a place um, where I went to Christmas parties, and not just me, but everybody else. We had Christmas parties there, and they had ladies' nights there, and they would do dinners there for veterans and this and that. Like it was primarily a place that made the community a better place in which to live. And it does seem, my concern with the idea of the Masonic Renaissance is it seems that that's more insular in nature. Again, it's more that esoteric idea of Freemasons are joining and they're getting a Masonic education, but the extent to which we as lodges are engaged in community support. Like, for example, I don't know any Masonic temples, and I'm sure there are some. And if there are, good on you, temples. But I don't know any Masonic temples that are involved in vaccine distribution. Whereas in the 1950s, I don't know many that weren't, that had a ballroom, that had space. And this will get me some hate mail. It's already got me some hate mail on social media. So, Matt, feel free to turn up if you want to. But I've said before, getting a vaccine is the Masonic thing to do. Um, I'm sure there were some anti-vax Masons in the 1950s who were, whatever the equivalent was at the time, but you wouldn't know it looking at any, now though, I know a lot of Masons who are trying to think of how to put this. I guess my point is it seems like in the 1920s and 1950s, men joined Freemasonry because they wanted to support their community institutions. And right now, there's a dangerous amount of people who are joining Freemasonry because they don't trust community institutions and they view Freemasonry as separate from the community. That makes any sense.
It does. And, for the listeners, the thoughts and opinions of Worshipful Brother Cameron are his own and do not represent his guest or any Grand Lodge jurisdiction. but that being said, you hit the nail on the head. There was a beautiful time in Masonry where we were the center of communities for gentlemen. It was always the Masonic Lodge. I mean, even today, many Masonic temples are still used for voting centers or community or other community organizations will use Masonic lodges or Masonic temples for their functions. The Red Cross, blood drives, whatever the case may be, that still occurs in Masonry, but not to the extent that it used to.
I mean, even sorry to interrupt, just one quick great example of that. The blood drive, absolutely. And even that, it breaks my heart a little bit how that's gone away in this district. There was a time when Freemasons were the leading blood donors based on, you go and when you donated blood, you give your affiliation, you say I'm with the Masons. We were donating more blood than any other group. And we know we're not anymore. And it's unfortunate. But even I can't think Copperhead Road, right? The song by took my Dodge to the Masons Lodge. Like it was just a place you went. It was the center of the community. Now we seem more insular.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that's really a sign of our culture now. If you want to get in front of people, you have to do it through they've got to scream in front of them at all times. So you've got to get in front of them that way. People are just not as involved in the community as they used to be. There's, I guess, more of the global community. They're interacting through social media across the world. And they've lost sight of their hometown, their community around their lodges. I think that has been a big part of the decline in Masonry. I think there's a balance there, and I'm an optimist. I just really think there's a balance there between what we refer to as the Renaissance in Masonry, the esoteric, the Enlightenment, and also the community service. And it all goes back to, not to get too esoteric here, but are you familiar with the word caritas?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So the Latin word for love, and that's ultimately where we derive the word charity from. Uh, and Greek, it would be agape, and it's a divine love. It's a superior love, superior above anything else. And we should be practicing that love in our lodge, that brotherly love we have for each other, and our love for humanity. And what we do in our communities should be a side effect of that love. In other words, it spills out of us. It's in us. We're contributing to the community, not because we feel like we have to, not because of some kind of obligation, but because of the love we have for our community. It's the love we have for our neighbors. And we've lost that. I mean, just culturally, I don't mean masonry, just culturally, we have lost that. And you see some cultures where that is still a very thriving part of their community. But yeah, I'll just say in the Western world, we have just completely dropped the ball on that. We've gotten so involved with social media and everything else that we've lost sight of what's going on right outside our front doors. And we need to change that. We really do need to change that. And I think masonry can be a catalyst to change that, but it's going to take work.
Does that? And I guess this is my um, my question. This is the thing I've been struggling with a lot. Is, I agree with you completely. It's not a Masonic problem per se. It's a societal problem. We have lost the sense of community and connections, and we see these fractures happening. Um, in how many riots, how many things have we seen over the last 2 years throughout society? And, I guess what I struggle with is, and maybe it's not an either or, it's just a balance. My emphasis is, I feel that Freemasonry needs to be primarily outward looking, foremost. Like, we should be, I don't like the idea of advertising per se. I think it's kind of garish, or I don't know what the right word is. It's not a particularly dignified thing to be doing, but outward looking in the sense of, like, um, going back to the vaccines, every Masonic temple that had and I'm sure some did, and if you did, get in touch with me, please, because I'd love to hear your story. Every Masonic temple with the ballroom should have been contacting health units about being a vaccine clinic. And every, there's so many charitable things and works and programs that Masonic temples and lodges should be at the forefront of that, and blood donor clinics. And every Mason should be, unless for medical reasons you can't, be a blood donor. And these things like this, as opposed to the insular, I don't mean insular in a negative way, the esoteric side of it, the Masonic education, especially when it's education that's only in a lodge. But I think, where you're coming from and where Brother Randy comes from, and where you're probably correct, is that, we can only look outwards so much if the lodge experience inside of lodge isn't enjoyable and fun and doesn't get people out. So that Masonic education, teaching people more about the symbolism, the mythology, the building of the temples, that's the first step to bring the Masons back in, and then we can worry about the other stuff later. Because you can only do so much in the community if your membership isn't engaged.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we need to tie those, just what you were saying, we need to tie that education, when we talk about the symbolism, we talk about building the temple, tie that to the community, tie that to our purpose. In a lot of ways, Masons or Masonry as a whole, we seem to have forgotten our purpose. And our purpose is really to make the world a better place. We really want to influence the world, not to take over the world by any means. I mean, hell, we can't even organize a pancake breakfast, but to influence our communities, influence our neighbors, to be that example, to be a beacon, something that they aspire to be as well. We need to uphold those morals and those values, and take an active role in our communities. I think that's a big part of what our degrees and our obligations are telling us. But we don't really do that, do we? And we need to get back to that, because I think that's a huge part of Masonry. I think that's part of our obligation to each other and to our fellow man.
Now, going to your part of the world in particular, I have seen on your Facebook, uh, that you are meeting in person. In Ontario, we are still not meeting in person. Right now, in-person meetings are suspended till September 1st, so knock on wood, uh, that at that point. But I guess in North Carolina, just what's it been like? Was there ever a time where in-person meetings were completely suspended? Have you always been meeting through the pandemic, and I guess just what have you seen? Have you seen anything change due to the pandemic, just in your lodges themselves? Uh, I know one big concern amongst Freemasons in Ontario is just the rust that we're all worried about feeling. You could practice on your own all you want, but as you would know, ritual practiced by yourself and ritual done with other people is very different, and you do need to get into that rhythm with your officers. So just on your end of the world, what has it been like, as we, again, knock on wood, come to the end of the pandemic?
Yeah. So we did shut down, like most of the rest of the Masonic world, in March of 2020. In fact, I attended a meeting of Sophia Lodge 767, actually Worship Brother Ben Wallace's lodge, um, one of his lodges. Uh, on that Saturday afternoon, we had guest speaker come in. We all went to a festive board that evening, and it was the very next week where the orders came down from our governor about everything being locked down and closed down. And so we did deal with that. I don't think any of us saw it coming that fast. We knew that, this pandemic with the virus was serious, but I don't think any of us imagined, as we were sitting around the festive board table, I don't think we would have ever imagined that that would be the last time we would do that for quite some time. And it really was heartbreaking. I mean, it was devastating to a lot of brothers, because we as Masons tend to be very social creatures. We enjoy that fraternal bond. We enjoy being with our brothers. And it was very, very difficult time, a scary time. We weren't sure what the future of Masonry would be. Now, fortunately, at that time, we had also just launched Refracted Light, maybe a week or two before the pandemic, all the lockdown started. So Refracted Light hit at just the right time, and hopefully filled a void there that was created by all the lockdowns and quarantines. We have opened back up to a degree in, I want to say, August of last year. Our Grand Master started to allow us to meet with, I think, no more than 10 brothers in a lodge. And then that slowly increased, but you still had to maintain social distancing. You had to wear masks in the lodge. There had to be hand sanitizer placed about the lodge. Everything had to be sanitized before and after lodge meetings. We couldn't serve meals in the lodge. A lot of that has relaxed now. It's not as bad as it was. There are some jurisdictions who are still under heavier restrictions. But what we have seen, unfortunately, I think, is like you mentioned, there's an apathy that set in during the pandemic with Masons. And we're not seeing the return to the lodge in the numbers that we had pre-pandemic. And to some extent, I know that's brothers who are still being very cautious and not wanting to mix again with the public, because maybe they have their own underlying health concerns, things like that, and they don't want to. And I get that. But I feel like it's much bigger than that. I think we just have a general apathy that has set in, and brothers, went a year and a half really without attending lodge regularly, and they kind of lost that focus. Maybe they lost the reason why they enjoyed going to the lodge in the first place. And I hope that changes. I really do hope that changes. But that's just been my experience here.
Yeah, anybody watching this, if your jurisdiction is opened up and you're able to, you got to show up. This is you're really are setting the tone. Like, it's the first few months, first few weeks as things reopen that sets the tone. If you're not making an effort to attend, or not even, who cares about your effort? If you're not attending, um, it gets hard, right? Freemasonry is like anything else. It runs on momentum, right? And you gotta just starting up again is a way to build back up momentum after the year and a half. So that would be my biggest piece of advice to anybody watching this. Even if you're feeling nervous about ritual work, we're all going to be nervous and shitty at our ritual for the first few months. That's the reason why in Ontario, at least my lodge, my affiliated lodge, we talked to a few candidates, right? And there's no intention to do degrees for at least the first few months because it's been a year and a half. We're going to need the practice.
But there are some of us who were shitty with our ritual even before the pandemic. I'm one of them. I am not a ritualist. I just can't. I try. I really try. I am not a ritualist by any means. I know the words. I know what the words mean. I know the meaning of the ritual. I could talk about that all day. If you wanted me to give a presentation or a lecture or a degree, oh man, that's just not my thing. I'd love to do it. I just can't do it.
But that's fine. Like, it's a good point you bring up there, right? It's not, if you love Freemasonry, and if you um uh, are a dedicated Mason, you will find the place in which you fit. It's like a puzzle, right? Everybody. So, in your case, um, it's the lectures, it's the educational side, it's refracted light. You found, obviously, and I can speak as someone who's had a chance to see a lot of stuff through refracted light, through your work with Brother Sanders. You found a way to improve the Masonic experience for myself and for brothers in North Carolina, and beyond, right? And if you're just crummy with words, but you're great with numbers, hey, we need treasurers. We need people who are good at that stuff, right? If um, you very much enjoy writing and you're a kind of a meticulous person, secretary, right? And if you are great at memorizing things and you have a theatrical side, then yeah, you'll be the ritualist. But you know, if you love it, you will find a niche in which to place yourself.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's whether a brother can memorize ritual and degree work is really irrelevant to me because there will always be someone to fill that role. As long as the brother is taking something away from masonry, as long as masonry means something, that goes back to what we were discussing earlier. We don't have to, they don't have to be esoteric masons or deeply esoteric masons. As long as the degrees mean something to them, as long as our obligations mean something and it resonates with them, that in my book is all that it takes to be a Mason. And unfortunately, I've taken a lot of heat for saying that I believe that there are many Masons who were never truly initiated, because to be initiated, just by very definition, is to be something that changes you internally. It changes who you are, your perception. And we do have so many men who've come through that have gone through the degrees, they've memorized their obligations, but it meant nothing to them. And so were they ever truly initiated? And I would argue, no, they were not. But for the most part, I think any Mason who takes something away, no matter on what level they take something away from the degrees, then that's successful. That's what we're here to do.
And in terms of that, I think that is I think it's a very good place to leave it. Just that idea of success, right? And defining success in a Masonic term, as you said, right? It's about, at least at the obligation part of it, right? It's not just about saying words and and taking the prescribed steps, or however it may be, right? It's about it's about a commitment, and taking commitment, and having something that hopefully changes the person being obligated uh, for the better. And then, to the extent that that extends out to the community, somebody such as myself would say, yeah, the hope is that then extends beyond, and that whether Mason, whether in terms of membership it grows or it declines, the impact can grow, because one dedicated Mason can do as much as, say, 10 um, uncommitted Masons, for example, right? If the community impact can be felt by just a few Masons doing the right thing in the community.
Yeah.
What do you see for the end of this interview? Moving forward, you've got the Masonic shirt. I know there's a lot of stuff coming up in the future. What's happening in terms of refracted light? I'll leave a link to that in the description to this video. Everybody should check it out. You've got some great stuff up there. I posted some of these podcasts on there on the Facebook page. Where do you see what's coming up next for refracted light and in your Masonic journey?
Well, as far as refracted light, I think right now you're going to continue to see new presentations every week, whether it be from the North Carolina Masonic Research Society, which I run, or any of the other brothers or lodges that share content. It's always going to be there. What we've seen is the number of brothers attending the presentations live is about a quarter of what it was at the beginning of the pandemic. And that's simply because their lodges are opening back up. They're becoming more active Masonically. But when we go back and look at the views, where people go back and watch the videos later, the views are staying consistent. So people are still tuning in. They may not catch it live, but they're still tuning in. They want those resources. So I think for right now, refracted light will probably continue to do exactly what it's doing. I have my own ideas of how I think refracted light should evolve, but those are just my ideas. And there's about 20 of us across the U.S. and Canada, admins that run refracted light and discuss these things. So it's whatever the consensus of the brothers is. As far as me personally, I locally in North Carolina, I was giving presentations almost weekly, or sometimes multiple times a week in lodges around North Carolina. And now that has opened up virtually to where I'm giving a lot of presentations, U.S., Canada, Lebanon, Scotland, really just everywhere. And I never imagined that brothers in Canada or brothers in Lebanon would even know who I was. So it's kind of, I'll say it's a little bit intimidating. It's very humbling. But, for me personally, I'm just going to keep on giving presentations. I'm going to keep speaking to lodges and just continuing to share that word and fellowship with brothers, and just enjoy what it is to be a Mason.
Well, I can say that with myself personally and my Masonic journey and my Masonic career, you have definitely improved it through your work with refracted light, through your work with Brother Randy Sanders. Randy's also improved it greatly. Got to mention him as well. He's how I came into contact with you initially, and the Research Society. So thank you for all the work that you do. It is very much appreciated, and I am proud to say, and again, don't get mad at Matt Parker. He has nothing to do with this part, but I got vaccinated. You should get vaccinated, but I got my second vaccination, which means as of July 5th, the quarantine I don't have to quarantine. So I am hoping to be in the States, and maybe I can make it down to North Carolina. I got to say, my biggest disagreement with you, brother Matt Parker, is I don't know where this derisive tone you have towards green beans comes from. I love green beans. I am from Canada, and while we have green beans here, we don't have them. They don't taste nearly as good as they have in the South when I've been there. I don't understand. I will eat your green beans if this is a problem, if I come and visit North Carolina. Uh, but yeah, I'd love to visit you guys down there one day and see some North Carolina lodges and even eat the green beans.
But we would love to have you, Cameron. Come on down. Myself, Ben Wallace of the North Carolina Masons, we will make you feel right at home. We will give you all of the green beans you want. We have a tendency to load the green beans with ham hocks and salt. Just they really are delicious. It's the thing about the green beans comes from the fact that at least around here in the South or good parts of the United States, the green bean seems to be a staple at every Masonic meal, and just simply because they're easy. Especially go to a lodge where they just pop open a can, heat them in a pot, and that's it. And I used to love green beans. That was one of my favorite vegetables before I became a Mason. And then I was just so burnt out on green beans. Now, that's not to say that if I go to a lodge and someone has made fresh green beans and done it right, oh, they're delicious. But for the most part, I walk into a lodge and there's green beans again. I mean, it could be a spaghetti dinner and there's a pot of green beans. It just doesn't matter.
Well, if I ever find my way in North Carolina, I'll take your share. They can come to the poor Canadian who doesn't get the fancy green beans. I'll mention, like, subscribe, comment, Patreon, all the stuff that you can do to support the podcast. And with that, thank you so much, brother Matt Parker.
No, brother Cameron, thank you so much. And thank you for all that you're doing. I love this podcast. Keep it up. This has been fantastic.